Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, on or about October the 13th of 2022, in the early day, this defendant, who at the time was 15 years old, went to school here in Wake County. He was living at the time with his mother and his father and his brother James. His brother James was a little bit older than him. He was 16 years old at the time of all of this. Both of them went to school that morning, and by all accounts, the evidence would have been that it was a normal morning for all of them. They went to school. The defendant acted appropriately in school, performed various tasks throughout the day according to his teachers and other witnesses, including turning in homework assignments and doing a regular day's work. At some point during the day, the two of them went back to their residence, which was at 5345 Sahalee Way, Sahalee. When they responded to their residence there, they were home alone in the afternoon, as is often the case, and apparently played video games and things like that. Around 4:20 in the afternoon that day, though, things changed for James and for that neighborhood of Hedingham here in Wake County. At 4:20 in the afternoon, this defendant went into one of the rooms at his residence, retrieved a .22 caliber rifle, and shot his brother James in the back of the head one time with the .22 caliber projectile that ricocheted inside and lodged in his brain, causing significant damage. However, James was still alive at the time of this event, and by all accounts did not see it coming. Or by all the evidence would indicate he didn't see it coming, but was still alive. He ended up in the bathroom in the master suite, or the primary suite, of his parents' residence. While in that room, the defendant, it would appear, then took a knife and began to stab his brother, who, according to himself, according to a note that he left, and would be consistent with the findings of the medical examiners here in North Carolina, that he was still alive at the time of that killing. He stabbed him and caused what the medical examiner would describe as 57 sharp force injuries to his brother, most of which in the neck area on the left-hand side of his throat and neck. The doctor would say that it was at least 49 stab wounds and 9 incised wounds, which would be wider than they are deep, or in a slashing manner. These injuries caused severe damage to James, to include injuries to his carotid and jugular, his vocal cords, and even damaged the vertebrae in his neck. They were deep enough. Eventually, James would succumb to those injuries. According to the note left by the defendant, it took about 10 minutes after he was shot before he stopped breathing. James would eventually be discovered once all of this was in progress of the other shootings that would later occur. His mother arrived home and entered into her residence looking for her children, trying to check on their safety. When she entered into the bathroom in her bedroom is where she was the one that discovered her 16-year-old son, but could not locate her brother, his brother. Law enforcement officers were there. They began to investigate and would later search that residence, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But from about 4:20, or I guess 4:30 or so in the afternoon, until the defendant is seen again, which would be at approximately 5:08 in the afternoon, the defendant, it would appear based on the evidence, went through his residence and began to collect the items that he would use to carry out this rampage on this neighborhood. He went through, selected various firearms that were in the home, as he and his family were avid hunters, laid them out on the beds within the residence, almost buffet style, to see what his inventory would be. There were about 5 or so firearms that were still located in the residence when law enforcement officers would search the residence later. There were hundreds of rounds of ammunition in boxes that were also laid out beside each of the weapons at varying calibers, between shotgun, 9mm, and .22, varying types of shotgun ammunition between slugs and buckshot. There were also camouflage gear that was laid out or found in the defendant's room, along with the ammunition that had been repackaged into travel bags, Ziploc type containers, that evidence would indicate the defendant's home, that they were not normally kept in that condition. They were kept in boxes throughout the residence. The defendant had been captured while at school wearing dark colored clothing when he got off of the school bus on video surveillance. When he later emerged, he was no longer wearing that, but had on full camouflage gear, a large backpack, and was carrying at least a long gun, which was visible and would later be determined to be a shotgun. The backpack would later be discovered and recovered by law enforcement when the defendant was taken into custody. And inside of that backpack, which weighed about 22 pounds at the time, the defendant had brought with him multiple bottles of water, prepackaged food, a change of clothes, over $700 in cash, again, dozens and dozens of rounds of ammunition that had now been changed in packaging from the boxes into Ziploc bags and would later be discovered to have been carried in his pockets, and various survival gear to include fire starters, a first aid kit, face paint, for hunting type behavior, multiple knives, fishing hooks, toilet paper, and a change of clothes. The note that I indicated was left behind by the defendant in the residence. And I'm not going to read that to the court. I'll provide it to the court as an exhibit and would ask that for the time being that it remain under seal until the sentencing hearing. But I will tell the court that during that note, he acknowledges his behavior and his intention to some degree and confesses that he, in fact, intentionally killed his brother and the reason why he did so. And so if I may approach, I'll give the court that, and I will mark it first page as States A and the second as States B. So as I indicated, according to that note, all of this begins around 4:20 in the afternoon. The defendant is not seen again until about 5:08 p.m. And when he is seen, he's captured on neighbors' Ring doorbell cameras exiting his residence, and he's now wearing that camouflage clothing that he would later be discovered in. He also has that backpack on his person and has a long gun, which is visible. But just prior to that, two ladies, Nicole Connors, who was 52 years old at the time, and Lynn Garner, who were friends, were neighbors of the defendant, lived a couple doors down. Ms. Connors did. She and Ms. Garner had gone out to celebrate a birthday earlier in that afternoon, and they'd gone to Red Lobster. They were on their way back to the residence and were going to go walk their dogs. The Ring doorbell camera and neighbors would say that they saw them out attempting to start their walk with their dog. They come walking past the defendant's home back towards the Connors residence with their dogs in tow. Seconds after they pass in front of the camera, you can see the defendant exit his residence, walk in a crouched way towards and a brisker pace towards those towards those two ladies, raise the firearm, and you can see that long gun fire at least one round. What would also be picked up on a different Ring doorbell camera is the audio of that event, where you hear that he fires what sounds like 5 gunshots from a long gun that would be consistent with the shotgun that he's later found to be in possession of, then transition into a handgun, what it sounds like, which would be a 9mm that he was later found to be in possession of. Ms. Connors would make it back onto her front porch, where she would later be found by her husband Tracy, who's present in the courtroom. She's deceased at that time. She is found on her side on the front porch of her home, unable to make it into her residence. She had suffered at least 2 gunshot wounds that appeared to be from a shotgun. And those were to the left chest, breast, and arm area, causing severe damage to her person and ultimately taking her life. She also had what the medical examiner would determine, in his opinion, was more consistent with a handgun or single round that had been fired from the back of her, in the back of her head, and she was found dead there. Beside her dead body would be her dog, which had also been shot one time with what appeared to be the handgun. Miss Garner was more fortunate in that she lived, but she was also discovered on that walkway leading up from the driveway to the porch or the front deck area of that residence. She was transported by emergency personnel when she was discovered, and as I said, was fortunate enough to live. However, she suffered serious injuries to her person, including from a shotgun, which caused fractures to her face, severe injuries to her abdomen and chest, and she's had to spend months in the hospital in an effort to recover from her injuries. She was unable to provide a statement to law enforcement officers for a long time because of the medical treatment that she was being provided, and she still suffers the effects of this today. As I indicated, she was taken and eventually did give a statement to law enforcement officers when she was finally able to do so. She was able to describe the young man in camo that was the one that did this to her, said that she saw him standing over her, and she cried out and asked why he was doing this to them. Forensics would eventually come to that scene and collect evidence that would be consistent with what the video evidence and the eyewitnesses would testify about, and that would indicate that at that scene there were 5 spent shotgun casings that had been fired from the shotgun. Those were kind of along the roadway and into the grassy area, which would be consistent with the path of travel that witnesses would say they saw, along with the path of travel that you can see in the video. On the porch of that residence in the front by the dog and by Miss Connors, there would be 2 spent 9mm cartridge casings that would be located on the porch there. As I indicated, there were witnesses who would say they saw this individual in camo that appeared to be the one that was in this area when the shooting happened, and they began at this point in time to call 911, and these are when the first 911 calls are coming into the processing center. As a result of that action at that location, there was also a neighbor's home, which is at 2201 Castle Pines Drive, which is the residence of Nicole Cooper. She was present in her home at the point in time and would later contact law enforcement and saying, look, I knew you had a lot going on at the time, but I have discovered that my home was struck with the projectiles that would be consistent with the shotgun. As you can see, the spray pattern on the outside of her home that entered in through the outside of her residence and landed inside of the bathroom, breaking her toilet bowl and causing some other damages within that occupied residence. And that would have been as forensically correlated with the event that occurred at the 5355 Shahaley Way, which is the Connors residence outside. A video from a neighboring street, which is at Black Wolf Run, would pick up moments later. As I said, that was at about 5:08, so 2 minutes later or so, at around 5:10 p.m., a timestamp would capture this defendant crossing down Black Wolf Run, headed towards the cul-de-sac of Osprey Cove Drive. That would be a cul-de-sac that would later be the place that Gabriel Torres his body would be discovered. That video shows the defendant walking at kind of at a jog at a brisk pace, and then getting into the street and slowing down to walk towards that location. Witnesses would say that they saw him approaching a car at that location, which would later be determined to be officer with the Raleigh Police Department, Gabriel Torres's automobile. It would be determined that he was attempting to leave his residence to go to work that day. He was at the time not yet in uniform. He was sitting in his car on the phone with his wife Jasmine, who he lived with at that residence, and their young daughter, who was under the age of 5 at the time. While they were together, the mother and daughter are on the phone with Gabriel. They are moments behind the defendant as he's walking that direction. The same camera or a different camera picks up her car making the turn about the same time that you can hear the gunshots going off. She says that she's talking to him. He had backed out of their driveway as he had always done, and as neighbors would say he does, he being Officer Torres, to wait on her to come home so that he could kiss his daughter and tell his wife goodbye before he goes to work. They heard the gunshots, and he made a statement to them that he might need to go and look and to see what was going on. He was not able to do that. As a neighbor would say, they looked out the window after they had put their 2-year-old, I believe, child down on the couch, and looked out the window when they happened to see a young man walking down the sidewalk in camouflage with a gun. He looked out and said, "What is this person doing?" At which point he sees the defendant walk in front of Officer Torres's car, fire around it directly through the front of the windshield, keep moving to the passenger side, firing 2 more times into that occupied car at Officer Torres, who was seated there and did not have a weapon on him at the time. Officer Torres was struck 3 times, or was struck at least 3 times by that shotgun at relatively close range. The witness says that when they saw this, they had opened the door and yelled at the defendant to have him stop, at which point the defendant stopped, turned at him, and pointed the gun at him as he was standing in his doorway. He slammed the door and ran back in, grabbed his child, ran upstairs, and he would express and would have told the court about the fear that he was experiencing at that point in time when he realized that he had not locked his door and had to go back downstairs unarmed, fearing that the defendant was going to come kick in his door or shoot through the door and harm him. He was subsequently able to go outside when he realized that the person had walked to the left of, facing the car, to the left of the car, down the embankment towards the Greenway. He went to go check on his friend, Officer Torres. When he got out there, Jasmine, Officer Torres's wife, was already there trying to save her husband, but was unable to do so. He subsequently passed away as a result of the gunshot wounds to his chest, neck, and shoulder area, which were done at such close range that when they found him, the wadding from the shotgun was still embedded in Officer Torres's arm. As I indicated, the defendant was seen walking down towards the Greenway at that Osprey Cove location. At that point in time would be when Mary Marshall, who was a 34-year-old resident of the Hedingham neighborhood, had gone out to try and recover her dog that had gotten loose. She had been on the phone with her fiance, who said he had seen the news and that she needed to be careful. She said she would get back in the house and close the door as soon as she could, but she needed to get their dog. She is found on the Greenway by other individuals who are traveling on the Greenway on bicycle and foot, face down, unconscious. When they approach, they see that her dog is by her side, off of the leash. Her leash is loose. The dog will not leave her side, and they see that she has suffered multiple gunshot wounds. She suffered at least 2 gunshot wounds to the head and neck area, causing severe facial and brain injuries, and another to her shoulder and neck, which would be slightly from behind on her right shoulder. At that location, law enforcement officers would find her, the dog, as I indicated, but they would also find one cartridge casing from the spent shell of a shotgun that had been fired at that location. As they moved further down the Greenway towards the suspension bridge and towards the river, you get to about the Bay Harbor Drive area of that Greenway, and the body of Susan Carnatz, who was a 49-year-old lady who had been out on her daily jog in that area. She lived at a neighboring subdivision, but would oftentimes, and was an avid jogger, would run that area. As she was running the area, she unfortunately encountered this defendant while her husband and her three children who were at the time 14, 13, and 10, were at home. She didn't make it back to the residence after her husband had finished his jog, and he began to question where she was calling, texting, unable to get up with her, became distraught and worried about what was going on when he's looking at her devices, which are telling him that she's stationary on the Greenway. So he decides, after seeing the news and that there's a possible active shooter on the loose in the Hedingham area, that he would drive to that location. He goes there and is directed to wait for around 30 minutes or so while officers are investigating. He provides this information for identifying purposes, a photograph, a copy of the map. Detectives with the Raleigh Police Department go down to the Greenway, where they find Ms. Carnatz's body. She had passed away from gunshot wounds at that location. She had suffered at least 3 shots with a shotgun at that location, suffering injuries to the top of her head, her chin, her neck, and head area, which caused issues with the jugular, carotid, her brain, and skull fractures. There were 4 spent cartridge casings found at that location. I have not told you this, but what we would later find out is that the shotgun that the defendant would later be found in possession of carried 5 rounds in it at the time. And so there's some reloading that apparently has happened from start to this point in time. The defendant is witnessed by individuals who are neighbors at that location walking down the Greenway and see him. They think that he's hunting. They go outside, and at least one of them says he's going to yell at the defendant to stop hunting, but then something makes him stop and question whether or not to do that, so he doesn't yell, but he hears the gunshots going off at that location on the Greenway, sees this camouflaged person walking by with the long gun that they would describe as a shotgun likely. The defendant, we didn't know this at the time, but what we later learned when we got a hold of his cell phone is that law enforcement are able to track his movements via the cell phone. He's using his cell phone at various times throughout his travel, and they're able to track that path that I've just talked about. They track his path as he crosses over the suspension bridge on the Greenway, and it looks like he immediately takes a right off of the beaten path and enters into the heavily wooded area, where he travels for quite a distance in an effort that the state would have contended to avoid apprehension by law enforcement. At this time, it is clear that there is a law enforcement response. They have flooded the area with lights and sirens. There are helicopters that are beginning to circulate over the top. It is an active manhunt to figure out what's going on. Neighbors are terrified. They're locking doors. Nobody knows what's happening if it's just one or more persons. He is able to avoid law enforcement by staying within those heavily wooded areas. He eventually, and if you look at the path, there's only so many places he can go because of water and fence lines. He's eventually forced out of the wood line when he reaches the trailer park, which is right there on the other side of the river from Hedingham, and he walks up the hill, where he is captured on video from one of the residents at that location at 1104 Blackbeard Road or Lane. And in that camera, you see the defendant come up. He's walking normal, at a normal pace, doesn't appear to be flustered in any way, is carrying a long gun, and he has an interaction with someone that is outside at that trailer park. You can't hear what that other person says, but you can hear sirens in the background, and you hear the defendant say to that person, hey, there's shooting going on over there, pointing back where he had come from, indicating that it was not him, that it was somebody else over there, and that he then continues back and goes back down into the woods, avoiding law enforcement, and does not fire at that person. He then is able to stay in the woods again for a pretty significant period of time, off the beaten path, following the water, until he eventually reaches another breaking point in the woods, which is at Tar Heel Club Road, and he has to cross the road more than likely to continue to get distance between him and the crime scene. Fortunately, as he is crossing the road, a passerby sees him in the camo entering into the wood line on the other side of the road and calls 911 again and says, hey, I've seen the suspect that believes to be walking in this wood line if you want to check. Law enforcement now floods that area, and they've got a multi-jurisdictional, multi-organizational response out there between the Highway Patrol, the Sheriff's Office, the Raleigh Police Department, and various other law enforcement agencies. They go into that wood line where he is and begin to kind of saturate that area in an attempt to either find him or flush him out to the roads where there are other cars that are there, or other police officers lining the roads looking to see if he comes out so that they can locate him. Law enforcement officers will eventually come upon a large property at 1533 McConnell Oliver Drive. The back of that property is abutted by woods that are pretty dense, and there's a probably 4 foot high, 3 foot high, 3.5 foot high fence that's out there, and there are multiple what I would describe as large sheds or storage areas in the backyard of that residence. Law enforcement officers would testify, their body cam would also show that they are following a canine track that had picked up and led them to that location. They jump that fence, and there is a shed that is closest to them. They clear that shed, members of the Sheriff's Office, the Highway Patrol, and the SCU team or SWAT team with the Raleigh Police Department. The first shed is cleared. As they are preparing to go to the next shed, they send the dog ahead to follow the trail in an attempt to not ruin the trail that the dog has. They end up in a bit of a holding pattern in between the two sheds. They're shining a light, and they shine the light closest to that far building, which would be the building that is closest to the home. As soon as the light goes into there, you can hear, and officers would testify, that there is a loud bang that comes from within that shed or in the shed area. They don't know where this gunshot is coming from at this time. Officer Casey Clark with the Raleigh Police Department, who was there working in an attempt to locate the defendant, is struck by the pellets of the shotgun blast that came from that shed area. It struck him square in the knee, where there is still a pellet lodged today. He would suffer injuries that would force him to no longer be a law enforcement officer. He still suffers injuries and the effects of that injury today with the limited use of the leg and it kind of giving out on him to this day, and the inability for it to support his work anymore. He's had to change his line of business from law enforcement, which is not what he had wanted to do. When he is struck, he immediately goes down to the ground and is calling out where he thinks the shot came from. Officers bravely grab him and drag him behind the first shed when other officers start to return fire to the location. It would subsequently, the evidence would have shown that the defendant fired at least from that shed area, I believe about 4 shotgun rounds were fired from within the shed. There are 4 empty cartridge casings from the shotgun that the defendant would be located with. He's in the far back corner, in a very dark corner of the shed. Law enforcement start getting various information that he may have bombs from other 911 calls. They call in the robot that they will attempt to use to separate him from the weapons. He's refusing to put down weapons. They would testify he's pointing the weapon at the robot, etc. He is eventually, and still wearing the backpack, he is eventually grabbed by the robot, drug out, and separated from the weapons. They are able to go in and detain him. He is suffering what appears to be, and I'll tell you why, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head at this point in time. When they retrieved the shotgun that the defendant was in possession of, there was blood and other matter in the barrel area of that gun that would have been consistent with a close-range self-inflicted wound. Where he was located, there is also a close impact shotgun hole or damage to the shed wall that is about head level where he was, that also contained various residue that was consistent with gunpowder, etc., indicating to officers that it was likely a close-range wound. Furthermore, we have all of the body cam footage, etc., that shows there was never any law enforcement officers in that shed to fire that round, and it would be consistent with the shotgun and the number of rounds that were fired when you looked at all of the evidence that was related to it. He is drugged from that residence. They already had EMS at the location. EMS is immediately on the scene. They begin to administer care to him. He is transported to Wake Med Hospital, where he stays for an extended period of time recovering, but as you can see, ultimately survived and recovered from those injuries. Law enforcement officers with the Raleigh Police Department began their investigation in earnest at that point and began to look into what was going on, what evidence might there have been as to planning or thoughts behind any of this. The bag that he had carried or that he had packed is located at that scene, and that's how we know what items were in the bag. He had with him, still at the scene, a shotgun, which would have had to have been reloaded after the last victim on the Greenway, given the number of shots that had been fired. Inside in the shed, there are 4 spent cartridge casings from the shotgun, 3 inside the shed, 1 that had not been ejected from the tube from the shotgun that had been fired, and then an unspent round that was still loaded inside the shotgun. He also had on his person the 9mm handgun, which also had with it 3 extra magazines. So 1 magazine that was loaded in the gun, 3 extras that he had brought with him that were loaded with varying amounts of ammunition. He had in his pockets loose amounts of cartridge casing or of unspent shotgun shells in the bags, as I indicated, multiple gallon size Ziploc bags full of varying types of shotgun ammunition that he had brought with him on this trip. CCBI at the time, now Wake County Bureau of Forensic Services, conducted ballistic examinations of the firearms in this with the cartridges that were able to be located from the scenes. They were able to make a match to a Ted Williams .22 rifle that was located in the residence to a spent .22 cartridge casing and projectile that would be the one that killed his brother James. They were also able to make identifications from the shotgun to the varying locations for each of the shotgun fired cartridge casings for the shotgun shells to match the weapons that were all discovered on the defendant's person at his arrest. Then they were able to get into, and I will tell the court that the defendant's parents were cooperative with law enforcement in providing them access to various things throughout the course of the investigation after the fact. Law enforcement were able to recover the cell phone that the defendant also had on him at the time that he was captured. As I indicated, he had been using that cell phone, looking up various things to include at the time and during the course of the events, this event on the news, kind of live following what was happening as he's going on the run through these wood lines. They were able to do a forensic examination of the cell phone and the laptop that belonged to the defendant. They were able to identify various searches throughout the history of that phone over the years, which I will talk about They also interviewed his parents, his friends, his teachers, and were not able to get any information from any of them that they saw red flags about any of this. All of the evidence it would indicate was that the defendant was good at covering this tracks or not being open about his intentions or his interests, as it were. Varying searches in his cell phone and on the laptop would include lots of things that would be very pertinent to what he would do, how he would go about doing it, and the consequences of the actions for people that might do things like this, even down to the degree of juveniles and the effect of first-degree murder for a person under the age of 18. He looked up varying other school shootings, varying other mass shootings, varying types of police responses and how they would respond to things, the types of weapons that were used by other mass shooters, locations that would be more likely to be deadly, to inflict an injury, things along those lines. And if I may approach, this is State's Exhibit C.
Your Honor, I do want to say that we received this 100-page report a week ago. Our experts are still evaluating it, and when it comes to sentencing hearing, we may have things to say about it. I don't mind if as part of the factual basis Your Honor looks at it, but I do want to make a note that I am not in any way, shape, or form stipulating to this because I have not had the opportunity to have it vetted by my experts, and I may later challenge it.
This is State's Exhibit C. I would ask similarly that that be held until the sentencing hearing from public. And it's as you can see, it's lengthy, but that's the report that was prepared by law enforcement. It'll give you an opportunity to look into that phone, and there are some dates and times and things that would indicate that these searches had been going on for a significant period of time. And by that I mean years. And we're not talking about just days leading up to this. A long period of time he's had, the phone would indicate that he is making searches, interested in all of these types of things and how to go about doing what he did. Also, they would find that he had gone on and done online shopping in attempts to maybe not even be able to purchase them, but had added things to his shopping cart online that were things like body armor, various weapons, face coverings, knives, things that would correlate with what he would eventually do and the types of searches that he was going through and attempting to carry out. And if I may have one moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
And so, based on all of these findings and the facts that they were able to locate, the note that I've proffered, the cell phone searches, etc., and the eyewitnesses, he was subsequently charged with all of this, transferred, and that's why we're here today. And I believe that would be a brief factual basis, if you can call it brief, as to the facts, as some of them that we would have presented at trial. I will tell the court there's more that I have not provided that it would be the state's intention to provide at the sentencing hearing when we get to that point in time.